right? There's a bar of honor and shame, and it goes up and down. Well, here, from some people's perspectives, it would have went down. Jesus is talking to a Samaritan. Jesus is talking to a woman. And Jesus is talking to a woman who apparently has done some stuff wrong. But here we see Jesus, his desire to talk to the Samaritan woman and to teach her, to make her a disciple, transcends those boundaries. Doesn't matter. And shame doesn't matter in this context. Remember what the story is basically about. The main point you find in 23 and 24. And we'll read that in more detail here in just a minute. I wanted to bring this passage up again. We're not going to read all this, of course. But the discussion goes from the physical water that she's trying to draw at the well. Remember, it's noon. It's probably the hottest time of the day, or a hot time of the day. I don't know about hottest, but anyway, she's getting water naturally. But the discussion goes from this water, the physical water, to spiritual water. And the Samaritan woman shows, I think in verse 11, that she's willing to entertain what Jesus has to say. Am I wrong? Please correct me. But am I wrong in saying that's like the first step of a disciple, or would-be disciple? Is to entertain what Jesus has to say. Just listen. What is he talking about? What does he have to say to me? I may not agree with it. I may not like it. I may not believe it. But at least I'm going to listen, right? So I'm certainly no expert in evangelism, right? But I would assume that should be part of our job, right? Is to get people to at least listen. At least listen. They might reject it, but that's the first step. She's willing to do that. And as we'll see later on in the narrative, she goes even further. Remember the comparison, I think these are on purpose in John, the comparison of potential disciples, Nicodemus, chapter 4. Remember I said his allegiance to Jesus is ambiguous. He can't quite get past the physical. She goes further than that. And in fact, we might say she goes way beyond that, because later on in the story we know, of course, she tells the city, and they believe in Jesus because of her. She goes way beyond Nicodemus. Later on, we'll see another comparison of disciples, incidentally in chapter 5, and then the healing of the blind man in chapter 9. Okay? Again, I think John does this frequently. So she's willing to entertain what Jesus is saying. Verse 12, are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well and with his sons and flocks drank from it? Are you greater than Jacob? And of course, Jesus basically says, yeah, I am. Verse 13, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. And the woman says, sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming back here to draw water. Do you think that she has now made the transition, at least in her thought, about this not being literal anymore? Or is she so gullible that she thinks there is such a thing as water that she can drink that she'll never be thirsty again? I think she's made the transition. What kind of water are you talking about? I don't think she's thinking, all right, yeah, I want some of this water. I've never experienced it. I don't know anybody who has this literal physical water. No, I think she's gone beyond this already. And then Jesus' response is in the Gospel of John. We've already talked about this some. They're just not what we expect. Anybody remember why that is? We've talked about this before. Why does Jesus respond to questions in ways that are surprising and maybe not what we would expect? Yeah. Exactly. He knows the human heart. He knows the hearts of individuals. He knows where they really are, right? I mean, think again about Nicodemus. Nicodemus comes to him and he says, we know you're able to do what you do because God's with you, basically. And Jesus completely redirects the discussion. So here he says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. What does this have to do with water? Right? I mean, that's the question. What in the world does this have to do with water? You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. All right, we stop there. Where does Jesus place his allegiance in this debate between Samaritans and Jews? Where does he place his allegiance? This is kind of a trick question, but not really. I mean, it's right there. It's on the text. It's in the text. What? Yes, that's correct. But, yeah, exactly. Both are correct. You're right. But in verse 22, he says salvation is from the Jews. There are a bunch of Samaritans that would have disagreed with that, right? But he does take it further. And he says it's not even about that either. It's true worshipers. And salvation is from the Jews. Let's explore that. Okay, yeah, he takes the side of the Jews. But why does he say that? Why does he say salvation is from the Jews? What does that mean? In what sense is salvation from the Jews?
The lineage of Jesus.
That's possible. Yeah, you said that's part of it. That's right. It's the lineage of Jesus. Jesus is Jewish himself. So yeah, I think all those things and probably more, right? So I think that's why he says that, but really it is about true worshipers. Okay, so what are the characteristics of true worshipers? Well, they worship the Father in spirit and truth. Worship in spirit. What does that mean? Does that mean, and notice in this text, it's not capitalized. It might be in some other versions. I actually forgot to look about that. But it could mean that they do it sincerely and they do it passionately. Is that what it means here? Maybe. Or we could say it's worship infused by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Would you say our worship is infused by the Holy Spirit? Let's not be afraid to say yes. It better be, right? Everybody in here ought to be infused with the Holy Spirit. We don't have to go any further and explain how all that works because I'm not going to get myself in trouble tonight. But no, our worship infused by the Spirit. It could mean both. Again, remember, John frequently doesn't mean just one thing, right? Purposeful ambiguity, as I've said before. Okay, so we've got that, I think. We've got both possibilities. And then he says truth. Truth is one of those concepts we've already seen in the Gospel of John. And we typically use this to show, well, there are true ways to worship God and there are false ways to worship God. Is that legitimate in the context? Yeah, to some degree. But is that all it means? There are true ways to worship God, there are false ways to worship God. Or does it have to do with the fact that God is faithful? Right? Remember, I said earlier, we were talking about the concept of truth in the Gospel of John, that it has the notion of faithfulness as it is attached to God. Right? So that's a little bit abstract here, but it could have something to do with the fact that our worship is governed by God's faithfulness and our faith in His faithfulness. Does that make sense? Does that sound about right? I think that's part of what's going on here. He says the Father seeks those to worship Him. God is spirit. Notice that's not capitalized. And I think that's not capitalized to avoid confusion of of God and the Holy Spirit. I think that's why it's not capitalized. But clearly, what does that mean? It's a non-physical being. That's what it means. God is spirit. And those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. And then the woman says, I know the Messiah is coming. And there's evidence that the Samaritans also believed that the Messiah was coming. Okay, so it's not like she's deviating from her faith as a Samaritan. They believed in the Messiah as well. They believed in the Jewish scriptures. They just had slightly different versions of it, and especially in the Samaritan Pentateuch. And we don't know a whole lot about that. But she says, I know the Messiah is coming. And notice the quotation marks end with coming, and then in parentheses it says, who's called Christ. Why do the translators do that? Because that's not in the original. Why do they do that? Anybody know? This is an aside, but I think it helps us to look at these issues to become more careful readers. Why is it doing that? Anybody know? Well, it is, but I mean, specifically, why is that bracketed away from her quotation? Maybe I didn't express myself clearly. Anybody know? It's because that's John's editorial comment. That's his translation. It's not her, right? It's not like she's talking to Jesus and she says, I know the Messiah is coming. Who's called Christ? She's not doing that. She just says, I know the Messiah is coming when he comes, and John has put that in there. That's what the translators think. That makes the most sense to me. Does that make sense, or did I just completely confuse that? Okay, one person says yes, we'll go with that. All right, so when he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Why does she go there? Right? Jesus' responses have been surprising. This is surprising. I mean, what is the relationship between worshiping God in spirit and in truth, and I know the Messiah is coming? What? Any ideas? He doesn't tell us. The gospel doesn't tell us. Any ideas why she might go there?
She may have some understanding of the Godhead three, the Trinity.
Okay. How would that relate to this then? That's possible. Yeah.
I think that she would realize that the Messiah, well, she knows, but she doesn't say that he's the Christ.
What, Jesus?
No, the woman.
Right, but the woman doesn't say that Jesus is the Messiah? Is that what you're saying?
No, say that she doesn't call him Christ.
Right.
Yes, she just calls him the Messiah because she's probably heard some rumors probably of the Godhead three.
Okay. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're saying that in talking to him, the way he's talking, maybe she's thinking, I wonder if this is him. In other words, the notion of the Messiah occurs to her as he's talking. Maybe it's because she doesn't explicitly call him that, but maybe it dawns on her that maybe this is him. And that's exactly what Jesus says next. I am he. I am. There's one of those famous I am statements in the Gospel of John. I am he, the one who is speaking to you. In the Synoptics, we really don't get anything that explicit about Jesus referring to himself as the Messiah. So this is one of those points of differentiation between the Gospel of John and the Synoptics. Yeah, sorry.
Is there any way that when he talks about worshiping the Father in spirit and truth, that truth is the answer to the notion of understanding or not understanding, which he'd already introduced, and that's why she responds in the way that she does, explaining, that I know the Messiah is coming and he will proclaim all things to us?
He will proclaim like the truth. Is that what you're maybe getting at?
Yeah, that would be a continuation of, there's the whole thing. He's talking about things that are clearly understood and what is not understood.
Okay.
Right? And that God needs to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And so if that truth part speaks to the proper understanding or a fuller understanding,
Okay.
then that would seem to make sense that she responds and basically says that she has the understanding. I know that the Messiah is coming.
Okay.
In other words, I know that
Yep.
this is all leading up to something.
Yep. She could see the connection between Jesus' discussion about worshiping in truth and spirit with what the Messiah is going to do. Yeah, she could make that connection. That's possible. What?
It's something different.
Yeah.
Another time
Yep.
is coming.
Yeah, that's a good point. Could be that. But whatever exactly is going through her mind, Jesus explicitly says, I'm he. I am the Messiah. That's what he's getting at there. All right? The conversation doesn't end, though. Jesus says, go call your husband and come back. The woman said, I have no husband. Jesus says, you're right in saying I have no husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and one you have now is not your husband. What you've said is true. So, this is difficult because why has she had 5 husbands? Now, our first inclination might be, man, she's got divorced a lot. But that's not necessarily what it is it? Maybe her husbands have died. But when you have several husbands die of mysterious circumstances, you might get a little bit suspicious. Now, of course, it doesn't say that about her husbands. But 5 husbands? I don't know, right? Now, it could be that, and some have suggested this, and this would go a long way toward this not being a moral boundary that's crossed. And that is, maybe she hasn't done anything wrong, in the sense that her previous husbands divorced her because she wasn't able to have children. That's possible. And then this 5th person that she's with isn't her husband. She hasn't married him. So that they're like not legally bound. That could be the explanation, but we're not told. That's the reading I was saying was it's kind of generous. But when Jesus says, you're right in saying I have no husband, the one you've got now isn't, that sounds like a condemnation. But what is her response? You're a prophet. How can you know these things? What does she say when she goes back to the village? Anybody remember? He's told me what? Everything I've ever done. So she's convinced he's a prophet. You see, we've already seen this, but we already see how much further she's gone than Nicodemus. And again, compare them. Nicodemus, Jewish leader, Jesus even calls him out on the fact that he's a Jewish leader and he doesn't know stuff. His faithfulness in chapter 4 is ambiguous. Later on, we know Nicodemus turns out to be faithful, but not in chapter 4. So we have this Jewish leader whose faith is ambiguous. Yes, he came to Jesus even at night, but he's to be applauded for that. But then you got the Samaritan woman, who I think the fact that she's out there by herself, the fact that she has 5 husbands suggests that she's even marginalized within her own society. Even among the other Samaritans, they would have probably felt like many people in antiquity would have felt. She's had 5 husbands? She's out there by herself? So, in other words, when you think about, and this is a hugely important point, when you think about candidates for discipleship, what comes to your mind? If I were to guess, it's probably somebody a lot like me, right? That's the ideal disciple, somebody kind of like me. But is that thinking about it correctly? Oh, of course not. So again, on paper, Jewish leader, Samaritan woman. Who's going to turn out to be the better disciple? On paper, there's no question who's going to win. That's not what happens. So I think there's another lesson here, is that disciples of Jesus don't look a certain way. They don't have a certain amount of money. They don't have a certain amount of education. All that stuff's irrelevant. What matters is, something I said earlier, are they willing to just give Jesus a chance, just to listen to him, just hear him out? And are they willing to act on that? That's really it. That's the important thing. All this other stuff doesn't matter. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about this group that we refer to as the church. When we were in Kentucky, before we moved down here, the preacher, he said this more than once, but I really liked how he put it. That we were a part of a fairly large congregation. It's not as big as this one, but fairly large congregation. And he said, I think there was like 200 there. He said, there are 200 different stories here I really liked how he put that. And of course, here it's even more, right? Different stories. But yet here we are under the same roof. If we were to compare interests and backgrounds and experience, some of us aren't going to have much in common at all, right? Does that matter? No, it doesn't matter. And again, it's back to this idea that this woman just doesn't seem to be the right kind of disciple on paper. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if she's a woman. Doesn't matter if she's a Samaritan. And it doesn't matter even if she's a sinner, right? And of course, don't misunderstand me. That part's got to change. But maybe she can't change her reputation necessarily. It's irrelevant. So then we get to verse 20. And she says, our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem. And that's when he says, there's coming a time when it's not going to matter where we're worshiping. All right, I'm skipping ahead a little bit because we do need to get through this tonight. The disciples were astonished that Jesus was speaking with a woman, but no one said, what are you doing? Why are you talking with her? Isn't that interesting? They are shocked that Jesus is talking with a woman. There's the gender barrier. It's explicit in the text. But they didn't ask him that. Isn't that interesting? They don't ask him, what are you doing? I mean, do the disciples ever do that with Jesus? Yeah, they do. They shouldn't, but they do it. But they don't do it this time. And then we have this famous verse, the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. Why did she leave her water jar? It doesn't say, but what are some possibilities?
She's more eager to tell the people she knows about Christ than the experience she's had with him.
Yeah. Right. She is convinced that the living water is more important than this water, this physical water. That's exactly it, right? The water jar doesn't matter. Now think about how this works first in the narrative and then in the rest of the gospel. In the narrative, she came out there to draw water. What time of day is it? It's noon. You think she's thirsty? By the way, did she get any water in the narrative? Not that we're aware of. I mean, she might have. I mean, these narratives, they don't tell us everything. So maybe she did. But it's not important anymore. She leaves the water jar there. So that contextually in this narrative makes sense. But think about it within the Gospel of John on a larger scale. We're going to see this again in chapter 5, but the water motif over and over again in these first few chapters. What have we seen compared? Water rituals of the Jews that are now superseded by John's water ritual. And of course, that includes later Christian baptism. Okay? And so maybe there's some of that here too, indirectly. And so she goes and she says, this man told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he? They left the city and were on their way to him. Now, we have a bit of an interruption in the narrative where Jesus gives this description of food because the disciples say, aren't you starving? And Jesus uses that to teach them a lesson, right, about spiritual food. And then we have another healing narrative at the end of that. But then we get to chapter 5. Okay, so we have to skip that and move on a little bit. But chapter 5, if you look at Jesus' healing of this lame man at the pool of Bethsaida, or Bethesda actually, it looks like another healing narrative. But the verses that follow tell us what's really going on. Again, there's more than one thing going on, particularly with these signs that we find in the Gospel of John. Jesus, on more than one occasion, heals people on the Sabbath. And I think that's worthy of a question, right? The why, this third bullet point on the left, is really for both statements. Why does Jesus heal people on the Sabbath? And why were Jesus' contemporaries engaged in debates about what could or could not be done on the Sabbath? And I think, of course, the answer is related. Here to the right, this is a passage from the Mishnah. The Mishnah was codified about 200 AD. So, and I've said this before probably, and I'll say it again because I think it's really important. We have to be careful when we use rabbinic texts because they're later. You just have to be careful with it. But, so I think if we can use rabbinic texts to get a sense of maybe, that's the key word, maybe what was happening at the time of Jesus, then it's helpful. And I think in this case, the maybe is probably, or almost definitely. All right, so it says, laws concerning Shabbat, that's the Sabbath, and festival offering and stealing from holy designated things, these are like mountains hung from a hair. They have few verses and many laws. Judgment, service, purity, impurity, improper sexual relations. They have plenty to be based on. They themselves are the body of Torah. What's this saying? I know we're not studying rabbinic literature, and you probably are very thankful about that. But I think it's really interesting, but I'm weird. So what does this mean, though? Mountains hung from a hair. Right. I think that's it. This is a hugely important issue. There's just not a lot to go on, right? Keep the Sabbath. Do no work on the Sabbath. Is there any ambiguity in that? Do no work on the Sabbath. Any ambiguity? You can say yes. Okay. Yes. There, that's it. That's the problem. How do you define work? And there are Jewish communities today that disagree about what that means. Some Jewish communities think that means you don't drive a car to Sabbath services. Others think, no, you can, right? So it's still something that's debated, okay? So why then does Jesus heal on the Sabbath? Why does he do that? And I think it's to teach them, we know in the Synoptics, to teach them that he's the Lord of the Sabbath. In John 5, it's a little bit different, as we'll see in a minute. Hopefully we can answer that question in just a little bit. All right. So in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there's a pool called in Hebrew Beth Zapha. That's the translation, or that's the variant that the New Revised Standard Version, there's a textual variant here. Bethesda is what most have. It doesn't matter a whole lot, I don't think. But it had 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who'd been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he'd been there a long time, he said, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Why is he at this pool? Why is he here? Why are these blind and paralyzed people here and lame individuals like himself? Why are they here? To be healed. How are they going to be healed? There's some belief that this water somehow will heal them. And that is, again, something you find in contemporary sources. We'll look at an example in just a minute. Okay? That's why they're there, though. But his problem is he can't get in the water to be healed. He believes he can be healed by the water. Jesus says, "Stand up, take up your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Okay, so this one looks pretty straightforward. And in fact, I would say of the 3 signs, we've only talked about one of them, the wedding at Cana, but this one's a little bit more straightforward until you keep reading you read the next verses. It's a lot more going on. Okay, so as I said, there's this belief that you could be healed by these pools. And of course, this fits with what we know about Greco-Roman baths that are just, the Greco-Roman world was filled with these baths, okay? This is a little different. Some people believe some of these places actually had healing properties. Josephus here tells us that even Jewish people believe this, so this fits very well with John chapter 5. He's talking about Vespasian. He says, removed from Emmaus, where he had last pitched his camp before the city of Tiberias. Now Emmaus, if it be interpreted, may be rendered a warm bath, for therein is a spring of warm water, useful for healing. Josephus doesn't have to go into some long explanation about, oh, by the way, we believe that these waters can heal. Why doesn't he do that? Because he knows people reading this are going to assume the same thing he does. Just how it works. So what Jesus does is he doesn't have to rely upon the waters to heal him. The question of, well, did the waters really heal these people? Irrelevant. Doesn't matter. What matters is Jesus healed the man before he went down there. That's what matters. This relief on the right is a leg. Okay, so we find this, it's basically like an ancient inscription, but it's got a drawing, like a statue on a wall, basically. And it says, 2K, which is like fate, but it's probably a guy's name. 2K gives a thank offering to Asclepius and Hugea. Asclepius, right? So this is a god who's associated with healing. And that's why this is there. There are so many texts in antiquity and reliefs like this which connect healing with Asclepius. But that's not the only one. So you go to these temples, you spend the night there. Some people report they were healed. A lot of times you would have a pool in that temple. So we see the Jewish people, some of them at least, believe that. Jesus goes there. He picks out this man who couldn't get into the pool himself. He heals him. All right? Straightforward. We see that it makes sense within the culture. But as I said, there's more going on here. There's a problem. And the problem is stated in verse 9. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews have two problems with this. Okay? Normally in the synoptics, what problem do they have? Jesus is healing on the Sabbath. That's the problem. And they have a problem. That's one of the problems they have, but that's not the first one, right? So the Jews said to the man who'd been cured, it's the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat. It's against the Torah for you to do this. Why? What would be wrong with carrying your mat? What's he doing? He's working. Exactly. We think, oh, that's so ridiculous. Well, let's be careful. And let's explain it. Why were they so particular? And again, we're not talking about all Jewish people, because there are plenty of sources from about the time of the New Testament where people disagree about this. Okay, so it's not the fact that, well, all Jews say that this guy was wrong in carrying his mat. That's not the issue. Some Jews were saying that's wrong. But why would they even care about this? Anybody know? Exactly. Why do they care about keeping the Sabbath? God commanded it. They're serious about keeping God's laws. We fault them for that? I don't think we can. Now we may say, all right, they went too far and they made these specific laws into something that is at least equivalent to the Torah, what was explicitly stated. Okay, that's a problem. But the idea behind it is noble. I think we have to admit that. Okay, again, here it seems ridiculous. This guy's been in this condition for decades. Jesus heals him, and now they want to say you're doing something wrong. But he says, the man who made me well said to me, take up your mat and walk. Who is this man who said to you, take up and walk? The man did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said, see, you've been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. So I think this is interesting, that he doesn't know who Jesus is when doing this. He just knows he's healed. And if you're in that guy's position, you going to do anything different? No, of course not. You're going to take up your mat just like he said. Why do they ask who told you to do this? What are they looking for, do you think? They could be. I think in connection with that, when they say, who's this man who said to you, take it up and walk, they're saying, who has the right to tell you to do this? Notice, this is the last thing I'm going to say because we're out of time, but notice they do not debate the fact that Jesus healed this guy. Remember, I talked about that before. They don't say, oh, come on, you faked this. You haven't been like this for decades. He paid you. No, that's not the issue. The issue is he's violating the Sabbath. And as we'll see on Sunday morning, they're also angry with Jesus because he heals the guy on the Sabbath, and that's the second thing that's wrong with this narrative according to these Jewish leaders. All right? Thank you.